Surprise! Hello and welcome back to Dynamics Unplugged and another edition in our series Dynamics 365 Finance and Supply Chain Management Dynamics A to Z. We had already posted a session late yesterday that most of you would have saw today. So happy Friday for the second time. The thought was we weren't going to get another video out before the holiday weekend for those celebrating Ramadan, Passover, or Easter. Have a great set of days with your family and friends. But we're going to post one more video. We're back with the letter V today. And V is for vendors in Dynamics 365. That lends itself very well, whether we're looking at workspaces, vendors themselves within different modules like accounts payable and procurement and sourcing, and many of the menus available. So let's start off with vendors. If your company is procuring materials or services, you need to manage vendors, even if you're only using D365 for financial purposes. You're gonna create your vendors and have a minimal amount of information that you'll have to maintain. There are mandatory fields like vendor group. Vendor groups allow us to segregate vendors by types. This is normally driven by financial purposes to not only group them for similar types of vendors, but default things like terms of payment or their tax groups. Excluding them from search results is something we can do, but it allows us to apply some defaults generally. Vendors can be people or organizations. The reason why you might have a vendor type of purchase is if you have employees, if you're managing things like travel and expenses. In D365, you're going to be setting up employees as vendors that you have to pay. After assigning the vendor type and group, you enter the value for the vendor name. You assign the default language. You could enable them for vendor collaboration. For the most part, you're okay with that minimal amount of information. Obviously, you're typically going to want to be entering more, whether it's for defaulting or managing that vendor account. So you would have an address, you might have multiple addresses. You're going to have your contacts managed from the vendor. Miscellaneous details could be used for credit, or if you're managing any rebate functionality with them. Obviously, if you're using multiple legal entities and setting up intercompany accounts, you might see this activated if you were to go to the general tab and enable that intercompany setup. Your vendor profile is mostly going to be for internal reporting and classification. These typically don't drive functionality. They're just checkboxes and reference fields. They will be useful in something like the vendor search capabilities, which we'll look at in a few minutes. Purchase demographics are also referenced, but these can help drive functionality and default onto transactions. So the default currency for that vendor, primary contact, line of business, employee responsible for this vendor, and that will default certain fields onto the purchase orders or other transactions. And then segments and subsegments can be used as well. Your invoice and delivery tab is going to be used in a few different ways. One is if you have a parent-child type relationship where there's an account or a vendor where the invoices are paid from, and then separate customer accounts for deliveries or subsidiaries. Vendors could have their own number sequence group. They could have their own price tolerance groups. They could have certain exceptions. And then you would also manage your default delivery terms and mode of deliveries that you would want to enter on transactions in that tab. Purchase order defaults, so additional defaults that you might want to enable for things like pricing discounts, default delivery sites and warehouses, advance notes and supplementary items. And you kind of start to get the idea. We have payment tabs, tax tabs to set up 990, 1099s, and financial dimensions. Your action ribbon tab is going to allow you to set up further information. as well as get to certain transactions and create additional tasks, activities, and transactions. If I go to the procurement tab, I'd be able to create new purchase orders, RFQs, requisitions, agreements for things like blanket orders, see open orders and product receipts that have been posted, see my trade agreement pricing, and my invoice tab is where I then get into the AP side. Once you have vendors created in the system, you're going to maintain them and use them. If I'm in the procurement and sourcing module, I have a vendors menu with a bunch of submenus underneath it. We already looked at the all vendors. I might want to see vendors on hold or put vendors on hold. Hold functionality allows us to stop certain transactions from occurring. So we can't use vendors for various reasons. Maybe it's because of poor quality or billing issues, or they went out of business. So vendor holds allow us to stop all transactions, just invoicing, payments, requisitions, never put them on hold, or stop just new purchase orders from being created. We have other pre-filtered vendor lists like vendors past due and vendors who are diverse, but I want to look next at the vendor search. This is a very useful form if you're going to be creating a new purchase order or you need to run some reporting on vendors. You can use this form. It's broken up into several sections. The top part gives us two parameters. Do we include employees that are vendors? So that organization type, can that be person or is it organization? And do we search across all legal entities? Then we get into our common criteria. Do we want to search just on particular procurement categories? Do we want to add any filters on a naming convention, location, any diversity information? And then vendor specific criteria. Are we using vendor evaluation criterion groups? So perhaps I want to only look at vendors who are being evaluated for their delivery performance, because that is critical for the new item I'm going to be procuring. I can have filters on only specific vendor groups. I can say that I only want vendors who are not on hold, add additional information like, do we bid? Are they a one-time supplier? Typically, I don't want them to be a one-time supplier, and more diversity information that can be enabled. That vendor search is really powerful. It then narrows down the vendors that I want to see, and I can go on and perform actions from there, look further into the vendor for more information. From functions, I can create new transactions like a purchase order or an RFQ, and I can also pull up related transactions from the inquiries menu for that vendor. Other useful inquiries and reports under the procurement sourcing module for vendors are vendor item relations. If you're using AVL's approved vendor list, whether that's by item or by expiration date for when that vendor is no longer an approved vendor for the item, they're very useful lists you can pull up and see who you can purchase particular parts from. Approved vendors can be maintained by the item model group or overridden at an item number level. So on a particular SKU, like this item number here, this high quality speaker, I can see on the purchase fast tab if there is a requirement for an approved vendor check when I place a purchase order or other transaction for procurement against that item. This one just warns me if the vendor is not on the approved vendor list rather than a hard stop. And you could also see I could do no check. That field, as I mentioned, defaults based on the item model group that the item is assigned to, and then can be overridden here on the release product. And then additionally, we have lots of inquiries and reports we can run for transactional statuses. Do we want to look up history? Do we want to look up open purchase order lines, whether that's by delivery date, by item, by vendor? Do we want to run vendor statistics like our top 100 vendors by spend? Do we want to run distribution reports like supply performance or vendor delivery performance on receipt if you're tracking on time in full or on time delivery? And then if you are using the embedded Power BI workspaces, you have things like a purchase and spend analysis and a supply risk assessment, which will show similar forms to the vendor delivery performance on time in full and item shortages or items that are critically low through an embedded Power BI report. And that is today's overview. V is for vendors in Dynamics 365 Finance and Supply Chain Management. Have a great holiday weekend, and we will see you all next week to finish off the series.